This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Coveil. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today has what you might call a deep CV, a deep resume. David Hand, statistician from the UK, the author of 30 books. Think about that, ladies and gentlemen. 30 books. That is immense attention to detail, immense discipline. I'm the author of a handful of books. 30. Damn. Some of his titles that you should definitely check out. The one we're talking about today, his newest book, Dark Data. And the book before that, The Improbability Principle. Definitely worth your time. Will absolutely cause you to think a hell of a lot more. And as a side note, David also spent 8 years as chief science advisor to Winton Capital. That would be the firm started by David Harding. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my interview with statistician David Hand. Going through your Wikipedia entry, I can see a lifetime of study, a lifetime in pursuing a field that a lot of us mere mortals don't really wrap our arms around completely. That's just one of the constraints that we're going to deal with in this conversation. However, what I want you to do to begin with is take me back to David, age 10. What was the influence? What was the inspiration? What was driving you at a young age to go down the field of mathematics?
It wasn't mathematics initially. I can remember very clearly I was interested in science fiction and so on, but it was computers. Computers were just being invented, if you like, then. We're talking about the 1960s, really. These thinking machines were attracting a lot of publicity. There was binary arithmetic was sort of the new breakthrough technology in some sort of sense. Magnetic storage was being created so that you could store instructions for computers, you could store data. Really very clunky, sort of steam-driven kinds of things. But I got fascinated by this and the potential. Clearly, computers were the future. So I got interested in those. To understand computers properly, you have to get involved with mathematics. My interest in computers sort of drifted into mathematics. When I went to university, I'm not sure it was possible to do degrees in computer science. If it was possible, there were very few such degrees, very few universities offering it. Mathematics was the obvious right way to go. And of course, I realized as I was studying mathematics more deeply that mathematics is kind of fundamental in the sense that it doesn't constrain your career opportunities and possibilities. You can go in any direction you want. And I didn't know what direction I wanted to go in career-wise when I went to university. Choosing something like mathematics was a good choice because it allowed me to prevaricate. It allowed me to delay that decision. I sometimes say that I still haven't decided what I'm going to do when I grow up.
That's the best way to be, though, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I should make a comment here, of course, as well, that I'm a statistician. And in fact, statistics and mathematics are completely different. They're in some sense opposite disciplines. I only discovered this sort of later on. When I did my maths degree, there was one course in statistics, one module in statistics, which I took, but it was very mathematically sort of oriented. The way I sometimes describe the difference between the two disciplines is that mathematics takes an artificial world. It takes a bunch of axioms, if you like. This is a bit of a caricature, but it's fairly reasonable. Mathematics takes a description of an artificial world and deduces the consequences. You say, with these axioms, what can I infer? What theorems can I prove? And so on. So it takes a bunch of axioms and deduces, if you like, what the data from that world would look like. Statistics, on the other hand, starts with the data. It says, this is what I've observed about the world. Okay, how does the world work? What must, if you like, the axioms be which produce these data? So in some sense, the two disciplines are completely different. They work in opposite directions. Of course, they're very tightly woven together. What I have described is a caricature and a gross simplification, but there's certainly some truth in that. They're trying to work in opposite directions.
Can I keep you at that early fascination with computers for a moment, 1960s? How old would you have been when you had a chance to see and perhaps understand the potential of where computing was going?
I can't remember the first time I saw one. I would have seen pictures of giant machines in air-conditioned rooms with flashing lights. That's what computers looked like in those days. And it would have been in my early teens, I guess.
When did you first have the opportunity to lay your hands on something, to actually start to experiment and play?
That would probably have been after my maths degree, which was very formal. Computers weren't really available then. It would have been as I drifted into my master's degree and then PhD. And certainly I did a lot of computing when I was doing my PhD. But in those days, of course, it was punched cards. It wasn't a keyboard on the desk, that kind of thing. It was punched cards. And I can remember walking backwards and forwards across the campus. You'd write the code, you'd walk across the campus, get the cards punched, feed them into the machine. The machine would kick out the results, which would inevitably have a mistake in because something had been mispunched or you'd written the code incorrectly. So you'd correct it, change the appropriate cards, try again, and go through that very slow iterative process. I would have been in my sort of early 20s then.
So I can think back to the early 90s, and there's nothing that's happened really in computing technology that's been a grand surprise to me other than a fact that an iPhone is now a fully functioning computer of the 80s and 90s. I don't think anything I've seen has been so much of a surprise. When you first had a chance to get a hold of this technology, even at the punch card level, were you already looking ahead as to what that could become?
I think that's probably true. Even in the days of punched cards, one could sort of imagine where you could key something straight into the computer, straight onto a magnetic tape, as it were, in those days, rather than via this rather clunky sort of mechanical medium. I think people did look ahead. Of course, when myself and other people did look ahead, you often got it wrong. I mean, none of us predicted the internet, for example. Actually, that's something which is new to you as well.
Half my life I've had the internet and half I haven't.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think none of us saw that coming, and the extraordinary changes that that's caused to the way we live and how we run our lives.
That's probably a great jumping off place to start to discuss data and dark data, because once we have the internet and all the data on the internet, there's nothing else because it's all on the internet.
Yeah.
Right? I'm being facetious in the sense that a lot of people really do think if it's not in a Google search, it doesn't exist.
Exactly. And there are different aspects to that. And I was going to say, it's all on the internet, except for that which isn't there, which hasn't been measured, for example, which you're missing. And you're right. People have tunnel vision, not only if it's not there in a Google search, but if it's not there in the top 10 pages that a Google search produces, then it doesn't exist. Yeah. I think in some sense, it's induced a sort of tunnel vision.
Since the title of your new book is Dark Data, why don't we start with dark matter? And dark data, you're deriving from that in some sense. Why don't I let you start there and give, because look, I've got a bright audience, but dark matter starts to stretch people's imagination. So why don't I let you own the floor for a few minutes to set the stage?
A few decades ago, physicists thought they had a pretty good understanding of the way the universe worked. We had matter, we have energy. Then it was noticed that some galaxies were rotating faster than they should, according to the laws of gravitation. Stars way out from the center were moving faster than they ought to. We understood gravity very well. We understand how it works on Earth. We understand how it works in space. But there was this anomaly. Something seemed to be wrong. And one explanation for that was that the galaxies were heavier than they appeared to be, judging by the stars we could see. This idea was developed in sort of great depth in theory. A possible explanation for it was that the extra weight, the extra mass, I should say, of the galaxies is attributed to this substance called dark matter. We can't see it, we can't detect it, other than through its effects on the speed of rotation of the galaxies. So it's something we can't see, but does affect things.
And that's a big inspiration for you right now in terms of a guy that is interested in data, looking at the statistics of data, and then realizing how many of us, yourself included, I mean, all of us, we forget about the dark part of the data.
Exactly. You have your data set and you think, well, this is it. I'm going to focus on this. I'm going to analyze this. Perhaps unaware that there are bits of the data, possibly large parts, possibly crucial parts, which are missing and which would really dramatically change your conclusions were you to be aware of those missing parts. Just like the galaxy rotation.
Even if they might not change your conclusions, they still could be extremely insightful. Let me give a great example, and this is kind of a twofold example. You will recognize the name. You might know him for all I know, but there's a guy, a little trader guy, and his name is Jim Simons, and he's done quite well in math and trading, as you know. He's had a pretty good career. I had an interview on this podcast, and it was with this gentleman who wrote this new book on Jim Simons. What's so interesting about the book to me, the most interesting thing about the book, was the data. And there wasn't much data in the book, but there was one little data series in the appendix, and it was his annual returns. That's not been published, really. That doesn't exist. There was a whole backstory about how the author, Greg Zuckerman, got the data and all that thing. But I'm sure a lot of people were just satisfied and like, oh, okay, that's interesting. We can see his annual returns. Hold on. What about the monthly returns? What about the daily returns? I want to know more data. Now, Jim's not going to give us that information, but that I think offers a great example as to things that are dark.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right. As you dig down into the details, you get more data. You might discover interesting patterns, all sorts of interesting discoveries in the data that you wouldn't observe when you only look at aggregates or summaries or high-level parts of the data. Absolutely. Yeah.
Let me keep you there for a second too, because I'm still curious to get you to open up a little bit about your math drive, your math background. I bring up a guy like Jim Simons. Obviously, he's done quite well. He's formulas named after him and all that kind of stuff. And I'm sure you're going to have an understanding of his work much greater than I, much greater than most of the audience. When mathematicians reach certain levels and they've achieved a certain amount and they've had new breakthroughs, how do you all look at each other? Do you look at it and say, well, Jim really worked hard and he figured that out before we figured it out? Or is it, wow, he just has an entirely different insight into math and data and whatnot than we all do? You see where I'm trying to go there? It's really, you want to understand why a guy like Simons is so good.
Absolutely. I think the answer is both, in fact. The point is that people who make breakthroughs and make great discoveries and have great insights are at the top end of the distribution. The key is that this distribution is a very skewed distribution. If you look at sort of abilities in degree results, the gap between the very top person and the second person could be as great as the top between the second person and the last person. Things stretch out as you get to more able people. Some of these people above the threshold where you think, wow, that's a really great discovery. Some of them will be people of the kind you think, yeah, I could have done that if I'd sat down and thought about it hard enough with a little bit of luck. It's not inconceivable that I could have come up with that. Other people, you look at them and you think, I just had no idea how he did that. That is amazing. And I think it's this sort of skew distribution which summarizes that. The people, as you go higher up the distribution, so the gaps between people get greater and greater. You get the same sort of phenomenon in other distributions like wealth and income distributions. If you look at the wealthy people in the world, the gap between the wealthiest and the next is bigger than the gaps get smaller and smaller as you go down. And I think it's the same with these sorts of abilities, if you like. I think intelligence is the wrong word, but sort of abilities to make these major discoveries.
Let me keep you at the topic, though, for the rest of our conversation, which is Near and Dear, which is your newest book. And if I'm not mistaken, I think I saw it. Is it 28 books?
This last one is number 30.
David, I know what you've been doing for the last 30 years.
Yes.
I've written 5 books. 30 makes me sweat.
I have to say that about a dozen of them are edited collections.
Okay, we're still in the teens.
I think I am very, very lucky because I enjoy writing. I know many academics, you've seen this even at the PhD level, they come to write up their PhD and this is a tremendous slog and they hate it. But I just like sitting down at the keyboard and writing. So I think I'm lucky, really.
I think what's interesting about dark data, and I've not read it all, but going through the Improbability Principle, is that, and look, for this podcast, I've been doing it since 2012. I've talked to a lot of very bright people, and I've seen a lot of business books, a lot of academic books. You're pretty damn dense where you're going. This is not light reading.
Right.
I mean, in a good way, because listen, a lot of books these days can be summarized in one sentence. There's no way I can summarize dark data in one sentence. I mean, I could try, but it's not going to happen. Let's talk about the origins of that, though, where you started to say, this is where I want to go for book 30.
Yeah. I have to say that I always have sort of half a dozen ideas for books sort of orbiting around in my head. And which one I write is sort of a bit like pass the parcel. It depends what happens when I sit down at random at the keyboard and start.
So there's another 10 coming is what you're telling me.
Well, maybe. Yeah. Many of these books, The Improbability Principle and Dark Data are nice examples, are sort of, they've ideas which have built up through my life. People sometimes ask me, how long does it take to write a book? And I always say there are two answers to that. One is 6 months, a year, the actual sitting down at the keyboard writing it. But the other answer, which in some way is the more truthful answer, is 20 years. The 20 years of thinking, oh, look, that's an interesting phenomenon. Oh, it's related to that. There are ideas. There's another example. There's another example. And then you have a whole bunch of examples illustrating some core sort of concept. That certainly is what happened with dark data. Over my career, I did a lot of work analyzing massive data sets involved with retail finance, credit cards, mortgages, bank loans, those kinds of things. Way back, I had a very nice illustration of dark data there, where I was asked to build a model to predict whether people were likely to default on loans or not. And they gave me some past data from previous customers, which told me the descriptions of the customers, the application form characteristics, and whether they had defaulted. All I had to do was build a model relating characteristics to whether or not they defaulted. But the problem there is that those previous customers had been chosen by some process. They were leaving out all the people that were previously thought through some other system to be poor risks. So they were a distorted data set. I encountered that problem maybe 30 years ago. Going back that far, there was an example of dark data. I didn't think it was dark data there. I thought this is an interesting problem of not seeing all of the data, missing crucial aspects of the data. Gradually over years, other examples cropped up, and then many of them are in the book. We have this sort of 20, 30 years to write a book, and then the 12 months sitting down at the keyboard, pulling everything together, making a unified whole of it.
There's probably a lot of different forms of dark data embedded in the question I'm going to ask now, the direction I want to go. But as we talk about the markets, we talk about trading, we talk about investment, you do have some experience there, of course. And this always causes me to just pause when I watch people attempting to take in all of the data that might exist out there in the ether to make a market decision, to make a buy or sell decision. They can look at crop reports, they can look at Fed reports. It just goes on forever. So you have all these forms of data. People have to take this in and then decide how they can make a buy or sell from it. And it just seems like so much of trying to use all of that data invariably should leave you thinking, what about the dark data?
It should. That's absolutely right. Yeah. Because never in life do you have all of the data. Sometimes people think in particular contexts they have all of the data, but there's always a risk you don't. And in this particular context, where would you stop? And there are all sorts of things which might have a bearing on the decision you're trying to make. Lots of them are imponderable. Lots of them involve data you can't possibly get at. But yeah.
Where would you stop is what you said, right?
That's right.
Yeah, because if you have 5 fundamental pieces of information, why not go find 5,000?
Absolutely. Those 5,000 will certainly contain more information. If you're lucky, there's a sort of diminishing returns. As you collect more data, the extra information that the new pieces of data give to the decision you're trying to make will decrease. But of course, you can't guarantee that. In some sense, that's a nice point. In some sense, the essence of the book is that you can't guarantee that. And in many cases, those extra pieces of information are crucial in affecting the decision.
Well, and you make the big point. I think you say it's your most important message of the book, which is be suspicious about the data. Where does that attitude come from in you? Is that just learned over many decades? Was there an inspiration? Was there a mentor? What was the drive that made you a skeptic?
All the mistakes I've made, I suppose, is a short answer. I don't know. I suppose being aware that things can go wrong in many ways. In this particular context, the data can be misleading in many ways. I've come across, illustrated in the book, many particular ways that the data can be misleading or incomplete or partial or whatever. But I can't think of a particular thing. Maybe particular examples like the credit scoring example I gave a moment ago are sort of raise awareness, makes one alert to these kinds of things so that after that you are looking for trying to answer the question, but what am I missing?
So, but if I take you back to that 10-year-old David, were you just, as a 10-year-old David, were you curious and a skeptic already, or was that learned over time?
I think it's learned over time. 10-year-old, I was probably optimistic about the future and so on. And over time, I began.
You're still optimistic. Anybody that can laugh some is optimistic, right? I mean,
True. But maybe it's tinged with a little caution now, which is really the point you made. Be suspicious. So it's tinged with a little caution. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think that's celebrated enough. People love the A, B, the binary. It's either up or down, yes or no. And there's so many shades of gray.
I think that's absolutely right. I think people find, and this is natural human condition, includes myself, people find it difficult to cope with uncertainty, to cope with doubt. But I think this is a key sort of facility ability that we need to cultivate.
I think it gets back to your point early on when you were clarifying mathematician versus statistician, where the statistician really knows from the beginning, okay, uncertainty is going to play a huge role here.
Yeah, that's right.
Let's open up some other examples. There's a very topical example right now as the entire world's about to end because China has unleashed a little coronavirus. But I mean, a coronavirus opens up a great opportunity for discussion in terms of dark data. And I'll let you perhaps apply some of the different types of dark data that you would see with corona. For me, one of the first things I want to know, who is dying? Who exactly is dying right now with the way that China unfolds information? I love China. I've enjoyed going to mainland China many times, but the way they're unfolding information, boy, we don't have a lot of data. And the data we can't necessarily trust is complete. And so this leaves a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, I think the coronavirus example is a nice one because it's riddled with different kinds of dark data. There's dark data uncertainty about who has actually been infected. Perhaps those with mild infections never came forward. So although China says whatever it is, 87,000 people have been measured positive with coronavirus, no doubt there are lots more out there who haven't been measured positive because they haven't come forward and had a test. We can't be sure about the numbers who've died. Have all of those who've died from coronavirus been identified, or have their death been attributed to something else? Then there's dark data about the incubation period when people don't know that they're infected when they travel around the world and that sort of thing. So I think coronavirus has many levels and flavors of dark data in it.
Sometimes when we don't have all the data, we still want to be able to extrapolate to the future. This becomes really tricky because this becomes often people, they want to make predictions. The data set looks really good. I mean, I just know that the market is going straight up in 2008, and there's absolutely no way that real estate in America ever goes down until all of a sudden we have a movie called The Big Short, and now we all know the story.
Yeah. I think that's a very nice example. One can build an economic model based on past data, and it can be very predictive, very accurate. But of course, if it then turns out that the range of variation in your past data was limited, then as things start to sort of bounce against the boundaries, go to more extreme levels than you encountered before, your model starts to fall to bits. It starts to deteriorate. It's not just in the markets. Physicists have something called cosmic variance, which describes the same sort of thing. You look at a part of the universe and you see, right, this is how it behaves. But perhaps there are other parts where they behave in same sort of underlying laws, but in dramatically more extreme ways. And unless you can build that into your model, make the model allow for that, then you're going to underestimate the variability and you can end up with the sorts of catastrophes which people in inverted commas didn't see coming, as in 2008. Extrapolating beyond the data in various ways, but one way, for example, is underestimating the variability because you're looking at a particular tranche of retrospective data.
In the last 3 or 4 years, we've had a couple big political events, one in the States and one in the UK. In the States, you had the election of Trump, and the UK, you guys had Brexit. None of the polling data, the so-called polling data that we're all supposed to believe in, that's supposedly accurate and whatnot and all this other kind of stuff, I shake my head that people still, right after the polling data completely misses, like two of the biggest events ever, people are right back to it, pretending like it didn't happen.
Yeah. I think that's right, isn't it? And polls, perhaps especially political polls, are classic examples of dark data where people hide things. In sort of pre-election polls, for example, people are often embarrassed about asserting that they're going to take a particular political position because it's, in some sense, perhaps in some circles, socially unacceptable. So they don't say it. So they're hiding that information. That information is dark data, which only reveals itself when the actual election occurs. And there are classic examples of this. I think the two that you've listed are good examples. Yeah.
I want to take you on a side tangent away from dark data for just a moment, because again, you mentioned 30 books, but there's another one that I've had a chance to go through too. And the Improbability Principle, there's some great insights there. I want you to speak to the way you open that book with the Anthony Hopkins example and let you tell that story. But I want to share with you really quick one that happened to me. I've spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia, years. Okay, I'll take some flights here and there, but not a lot. And so occasionally I'll take a red-eye flight if I'm flying to North Asia. Not a lot, a couple times a year. And it just so happens that I was in the business class lounge, sitting, playing on my phone or playing on my computer next to a power outlet. And a guy taps me on the shoulder. He says, "Can I share your power outlet?" And he had some splitter. I said, "Sure, jump in." And I looked at him. I realized who it was. I'm in a lounge of like 50 people. No one else realized who he was. I realized who he was immediately. And I said, "Sure, as long as you give me a selfie." So I took a selfie with this guy. He smiled, turned around, started doing whatever he was doing on his computer. My father is sitting across from me. He looks at me like, "What? Who are you talking? Who is that kind of chubby, graying guy there? Who is that?" Steve Wozniak.
Oh, wow. Yes.
So now run through. You are the guy that has been in the middle of stats and math. Run through the chance of that little one happening. I mean, you would say that's completely improbable, Mike. It would never happen. It happened.
Yeah, that's exactly what the improbability principle is about. It looks at extraordinary coincidences, highly improbable events like that, looks down into the maths, the statistics, the science of that to discover why that sort of thing happened, how often you'd expect it to happen, and so on. And if you like, it sort of debunks the notion that there's some sort of mystical force in the universe which is leading those things to happen more often than they should. It shows that you should expect those things to happen. The Anthony Hopkins story is similar. He was going to star in a film called The Girl from Petrovka by George Pfeiffer. He went to London to buy a copy of the book so that he could read up the role, but he couldn't find a copy of the book. All the bookstores were sold out. This was before the days of Amazon. It was in the 1970s. But then on his way home, on the London Underground, he saw a book lying on the seat next to him while he was waiting for the train. It turned out to be a copy of the very book he was looking for, The Girl from Petrovka. Later on, when Hopkins told the author, George Pfeiffer, about this, Pfeiffer said he lent a copy of the book to a friend who was going through it, making notes, turning the British English into American English spelling and so on. But his friend had lost the copy, left the copy on the train somewhere on his journey. When Hopkins looked into the book that he had found on the train, it turned out to be that very one. This is a story that I put in the Improbability Principle. Sometimes after that, after my book appeared, after the Improbability Principle appeared, I got a phone call from George Pfeiffer, the author, who said, yes, that's exactly what happened. And then the next time I was in New York, I met George Pfeiffer and we swapped a copy of The Girl from Petrovka for a copy of the Improbability Principle.
But now people are still going to hear that and just think, no way, that's completely... I mean, I have no doubt that it happened. I mean, there doesn't make any... Just like my Wozniak story, I have the selfie proof, so...
Yeah, yes. The Improbability Principle, although I called it a principle, it is in fact 5 sort of laws of improbability which sort of braid together to make the Improbability Principle. One of them is that there are a hell of a lot of people traveling around the world, reading books and so on. If you look at the sheer numbers involved, you would expect this sort of thing to happen occasionally. Of course, when it happens, you notice. For example, when it happened to you, you didn't just forget about it. In fact, were sort of knocked off your feet, you took a photograph of it, and so on. Similar sort of thing for Hopkins in this situation. Attention is drawn to it. But you would expect this sort of thing to happen occasionally just because of the sheer numbers of opportunities for it to happen, even though it's got a very low chance of happening. In fact, when I looked at improbable events, highly improbable events for the book, I found that there were a number of genres of different kind of improbable events. A lost and found book is one of them. There are quite a few stories about people who lost their favorite book when they were a child and then found them in a secondhand bookshop 30 years ago in an entirely different country, that sort of thing. There is lost jewels. You lose a ring over the side of a ship and then it's found in a fish's stomach, that kind of thing. There are one or two sort of genres of highly improbable events, but you can explain them all. As I say, one of the laws of the improbability principle is that if you've got something which has got a very tiny chance of occurring, but you give it enough opportunities to occur, eventually the number of opportunities overwhelm the tiny chance, and it's not at all surprising that it should occur.
Well, here's another way to look at my little story. Okay, I'm in the business class lounge in Saigon's airport flying to Tokyo. That already is a little bit different. Not saying I'm special, I'm just saying that that would be where you might typically expect a certain class of traveler to be. That would be typically where if somebody was giving a speech, they might be flying that class of airplane. Here's the biggest kick. The biggest kicker would be, well, if I would have met somebody a little less famous or a little less known, I still would have thought that that was really cool and interesting.
Exactly. You've put your finger on two other threads of the improbability principle. One is that, in fact, the probability, the tiny probability we're talking about, is not so tiny because you're likely to be traveling in that sort of class, in that sort of place and going to that sort of event and so on. The chance is not that small. And then, of course, when you add up all the number of opportunities for it to happen, it becomes more likely. I can't remember the second one, but yeah, there are other strands of the improbability principle, which you've correctly seen all sort of begin to bear on this. So in fact, it becomes quite likely this sort of encounter would happen to you over the course of your life.
Let me flip you back to a little more dark data, fabricated data. And I think for me, maybe I'm going to be going in the wrong direction here, but I can think of something like, again, if I'm talking about trading performance reports, Jim Simon's annual returns so consistent as they are, well, Madoff had really consistent returns. It's amazing how fabricated data can fool people. Explain your destination with dark data and fabricated data.
Yeah, absolutely right. Fabricated data, fraudulent data. Fraudulent data are a kind of fabricated data. People make up stories. They make up, in some cases, real data. In scientific fraud, there aren't that many scientific frauds, but when there are, people often make up data and say, look, this is what my experiment produced, whereas in fact it's entirely fabricated to mislead people. Fabricated data is interesting because it turns out that it's more difficult to make realistic looking fabricated data, to make artificial data which is realistic than you might think. Statisticians have developed tools to probe data to look for patterns which you wouldn't have expected to arise naturally. For example, if you ask people to generate a string of random numbers, random digits, 1, 2, 5, 6, 7, 3, and so on, people have a tendency to have too few consecutive digits the same, for example. There are a whole set of rules like that you can sift through data sets to see if it looks suspicious. Of course, looking suspicious doesn't in itself mean that it's fraudulent or fabricated, but it raises your suspicion and you can then go and check it in other ways.
That's interesting about Madoff because there was really the one dogged researcher that really went down the path, because Madoff was pretty clever in the sense that if you're going to deliver fake returns, then only give people 1% to 2% a month.
Exactly. Yes, yes.
It doesn't look that big, except it's the consistency of the data that should have raised red flags, because markets and strategies just don't deliver consistent returns generally.
Yeah, this is an interesting point because it makes one wonder. The people who are not that good, we can detect when they fabricate the data. The people who are better, well, with a bit more effort, Madoff would be an example, then it can be detected. Are there also people out there who are so good that we're not spotting it?
I've had that in my notes here. It's like, okay, we could talk about Jim Simons because we know about Jim Simons. Who do we not know about?
Exactly. Yeah. Who is clever enough so that they keep just below the radar, so they're doing very well, but not so well that they're drawing attention to themselves? You're making me think this is the way we should start to go when we're looking for fraudsters. Yeah.
Well, what's interesting too is, like, for example, I'm looking at, I keep talking about it, this Simon's data, which was such an interesting set to me. And it looks like it ranges pretty much over the decades, like a low of 20% a year, 30, 40%, maybe on average 40 or so percent. But if you don't know what's happening over the course of the year, you're just left to assume, oh, he must consistently make the same each month to end up with that annual return. But we have no idea.
Yeah, yeah. Coming back to the point you made earlier, and I think it's a very good point, that if you look at aggregates, summaries, overall high-level numbers, that can be very misleading about what is actually going on in the data. I mean, you see this in a different and very crude example when people give you an average. They say the average weight or the average income or whatever is such and such. And that's okay. That tells you some information, but it's missing out so much more information. If somebody tells you the average, does it mean that almost everybody is less than that average and there are just one or two people with a huge value bigger than that, so that that's the average? Or does it mean that almost everybody is grouped very closely about that average? They're missing out all sorts of pieces of information, which could be crucial for whatever question you're trying to answer or whatever it is you're trying to understand, whatever decision you're trying to make.
And people make bad decisions off bad data sets every day, every minute.
Yep.
While your work is very dense, very thoughtful, very detailed, just the big picture of your work should cause the average person to pause for a second and say, yeah, maybe I need to do a little bit more homework. I need to have a little bit wider lens here and not just make so many assumptions and trust so much.
Yeah, I think that phrase I hadn't encountered before, wider lens. I think that's a very nice phrase to describe. It's a more positive way of putting be suspicious. Yes, yes.
Hey, let me ask you one thing you've had a chance to do in your career also. You've had a chance to be with Winton Capital.
That's right. Spent 8 years as their chief scientific advisor. Yeah.
That must have been fun, interesting, engaging.
It was, yeah, fascinating. Winton was very scientifically oriented. It sort of, in some sense, saw itself as a science company because it was analyzing data, looking for patterns, features, configurations, and so on, trying to understand what was going on so that then it could build predictive models based on the understanding it had got. Of course, as you will know, making predictions, finding patterns in financial data is very, very tough. It's tougher than any other problem area I've encountered, except for possibly high energy physics, where you've got huge amounts of variability in the data in the financial markets, so that the actual signal is tiny compared with the noise. And that makes it, A, fascinating from a technical statistical point of view, and B, very tough. So a great area to work in, yeah.
Going back a long time ago, I've had the good fortune, not as much time as you, but the good fortune to have a good handful of conversations with the head of Winton Capital. I really, really always enjoyed his perspective because I just thought very straight talker with me, and behind the scenes, I just really, really enjoyed his perspective. What was the biggest takeaway that you took away from being at Winton? Was there any great learning lesson for you that made you see things differently? Or was it the application of a lot of your work that you were seeing in their trading models?
Certainly some of it. I suppose one of the things that it brought home to me forcefully, something I'd already encountered in other areas, but I think Winton was a very nice example of this, was the importance of having people who knew the domain on the one hand, teams, if you like, people who knew the domain and people who knew the statistics, machine learning, AI, whatever, algorithms, who really understood the technology, and people who understood the nature of financial markets working together.
The combination.
The combination, yeah. It's not enough to just be a brilliant expert in machine learning. It's not enough just to know about the technical details of the financial markets. It's putting the two together which enables advances to be made. And I think that applies in every other area. In genomics, for example, you need to understand the background biology. You need to have somebody who understands the background biology and someone who understands the capabilities and limitations of the statistical and machine learning models and so on, if you're going to make real advances.
When you look ahead to your future, the way that our statistical understandings keep unfolding, what types of interesting advances do you see? I asked you this question when you're about 10 years old. We kind of talk about how computing can unfold. Look, I've had some guests on this podcast that posit, and they say, well, hey, if one wants to theorize, the movie The Matrix might not be completely improbable. There could be a little girl in a Star Trek episode playing with her version of the toy Earth that we all exist on. When you look ahead, what do you see coming down the pike in the decades ahead that everyone might not be thinking about?
Yeah. Predicting the future is notoriously difficult.
The whole point of this conversation, right?
Yeah. Nevertheless, very nice question. I think one of the issues, I don't know, I was going to say one of the issues is the sort of economic limitations bump up against technological advance, whether that will slow down the rate of progress. But I'm not sure the way computers are developing, and indeed with the potential for things like quantum computing and so on, and Moore's law illustrates these sorts of things, maybe that's not something to worry about. I suppose if one broadens your question, one worries about sort of unexpected consequences. So climate change is a primary example of that. A couple of decades ago, not very many people were thinking about the way things were going. Now, of course, we're increasingly aware of the risks and consequences, and which is going to put a tremendous sort of damper on human progress, or at least risks doing that. So I think there's that problem. In terms of the actual details of the technology, I suppose one of the key things is that we need combined engineering and natural science technology with social science technology, because if you think about it, all the advances that really changing society involve social science. There are things like Google and Amazon, the way shopping is done and so on. So I think we need to understand those impacts on society, as well as the lower level technical details of how we build a better computer or better algorithm to do something. I think the two have to work hand in hand.
You mentioned the social sciences, and we just had that brief conversation about Winton, a shop all based on science and coding and whatnot. But one of the most interesting documents that I've seen Winton produce in the last handful of years is this very colorful retrospective on historical bubbles, which is all the social sciences right there. It's all the human aspect.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that nicely illustrates the sort of interplay between the two and the importance of taking both the social science and the physical sciences into account. Yeah.
David, I could probably pick your mind for hours and hours on just all kinds of random stuff and force you to go, what direction is Mike going? I have no earthly idea. But hey, it kind of makes sense when it's all said and done. Where can we send people? The book, Dark Data, Why What You Don't Know Matters, the Improbability Principle, another one. I think maybe that's book 29. Why Coincidences, Miracles, and Rare Events Happen Every Day. Where can we send people, David, besides Amazon and book buyers and all that stuff?
I have a website for the Improbability Principle, and I invite people to put their stories up on the website. Currently in the process of creating a website for Dark Data. I think this one will be slightly different. While I'll be happy to have people's stories, I probably use it in a slightly different way, where I identify dark data issues in the media and in life and put those up to show that these things are pervasive, to show that people need to approach data conclusions with a little bit of suspicion.
What is that Improbability Principle website, David?
Improbability-principle.com.
There you go. Easily found. If they can't find it, they probably need some additional training of some sort.
Yeah, that's it. Improbability-principle.com.
Hey, David, appreciate you coming on, and you've given me books to reread.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me on, and thank you for such stimulating and interesting questions. You made me think.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.